I didn't even have to say anything, and you all got quiet. That was great. Well, hello. Welcome to welcome to Christian Student Fellowship. This is the CSF building across the street, but you're at a Lewis House lecture. We don't need to get into the distinction right now. We can talk about it later. But normally our Lewis House lectures are across the street in our basement at the Lewis House. If you haven't had a chance to visit, you should wander over there because it's a beautiful spot, got a great library. I assume if you're here, you're a bookish person and you like libraries, so check it out after this. But we realized with bringing Malcolm in that we might have a bigger crowd than normal, and I guess we were right. So we thought we would come over here, and CSF graciously allowed us to use the building. I am sorry about the parking situation. The weather obviously wasn't great, and made it a little bit more difficult to park on the street as normal, and I guess this is what happens when you bring in a big YouTube star, is you get a big crowd like this. A couple of announcements before we get going. We do have, after the lecture, we'll have a bookstore right outside here that will sell some of Malcolm's books. We normally, sell the speaker's books. I don't think we have many, so if you are eager to grab one, rush out. It might be a mad dash to get to the books first. But you can buy a few of Malcolm's books. Not all of them. There are more than even we are selling out there. We want to let you know, too, about a few things that we have going on at Lewis House that we're excited about, that we hope you all are excited about as well. We are excited to announce our fall class schedule. You may know that we offer courses in accredited courses in Christian thought through Asbury University, our gracious partnership with them. And UK students take our classes and can transfer them to UK to get class credit for them. And this fall, we're excited to announce that we're going to offer basic Christian doctrine and Christian apologetics. And I'm going to be teaching the theology class. Our own Nick Grounds will be teaching the apologetics course. These are some of our rotation classes that seem to be very popular, and we've had people asking about them, so we're going to offer both of those as well. More information will come out soon on that, including times, location, all that fun stuff. And you can follow, of course, Lewis House on social media to get more information about these types of events, but also our classes and our scholars program. This is another thing I'm excited to announce, is that the application will be out soon. We have a 2-year curriculum track that we run our scholars through, and it's an application process. If you're a student in the area and you're interested in learning more about that, you can visit our website or find a staff member after. But you get actually paid to come read books with us. So I don't even understand why, we don't get thousands of applicants every year. But if you're interested in applying to that and getting paid scholarship money toward your UK degree to come read books in Christian thought with us, please check out our social media and website for more info. Of course, also, if you're interested in hearing more from Malcolm, we'll release this talk, and then we recorded earlier today a podcast with Malcolm that was absolutely delightful and is going to supplement this talk very, very well. Malcolm will also be at Asbury University Chapel tomorrow, so if you're interested in hearing more from him, you can visit the chapel, and he'll also be lecturing at Anchor Baptist on Thursday night at 7 p.m. on why Christians should love poetry. So again, if you just can't get enough, which I feel like that a little bit, I'm like, I need to go check out these other events. There are more opportunities to hear from Malcolm while he is in town. And then finally, on the Lewis House front, we are pleased to host Molly Wortham at our next Lewis House lecture, and that is going to be Wednesday, March 4th. And I draw your attention specifically to the Wednesday. We normally have our lectures on Tuesday evening, but this next one will be Wednesday, March 4th. She is an academic that has a really interesting story of moving from atheism into faith, and we're going to interview her about that. So we're really excited to have Molly Wortham in. I also want to say a very special thank you to a few people, specifically Michael and Nicole Sloan and Richard and Connie Jurack. They are the sponsors for tonight's event, and this event could not have happened without them. And so we are very grateful. And if you're interested in sponsoring a lecture, you can come talk to one of our staff members about it. That's something that we do. But even just relationally, how the Malcolm event unfolded, it would not have happened without these folks. So we're very grateful to them. Okay, now to the question that's been haunting me all day, which is, how do you introduce Malcolm Guite? Malcolm is a poet, he's a musician, an academic, he's a priest. He received a BA and an MA in literature from Cambridge and a PhD from Durham University. And he's been an ordained priest in the Church of England since 1991. He's, of course, written several books on poetry, literature, the imagination, much of it at the intersection specifically of imagination and theology, which is his topic tonight. And of course, in addition to that work, he is a YouTube star. You may know him from his YouTube videos. But where I think really brings out Malcolm and his personality is he's the only person I know who has received a fanboy email from N.T. Wright. I think that's pretty impressive. And he was once introduced by Jeremy Begbie like this. Jeremy Begbie said of Malcolm, "If John Donne or George Herbert journeyed to Middle Earth by way of San Francisco, took musical cues from Jerry Garcia and fashion tips from Bilbo Baggins, and rode back on a Harley, please welcome Malcolm Guite."
Well, thank you very much for those kind words. I don't think I'll ever live down Jeremy Begbie's particular description. Actually, the same time he unleashed that description was at Duke Divinity. He told me that he had written in his script, he lectures widely in the UK and America. But what he actually said from the podium was, he lectures wildly in the UK. So I have to live up to that too. So, imagination and the kingdom of God. I'm going to talk, when we speak of imagination, particularly of the poetic imagination, since that's the bit of it that I suppose I've explored most and know most of, though we could develop this in all kinds of ways, including thinking about the moral imagination and indeed the prophetic imagination. But we'll stick with poetry for now. And we really need to start by... Oh, by the way, I feel I should say this, because we have a mixed group. I don't know what's drawn different people in different ways. But since the word poetry and poetic didn't actually appear in the advertised lecture title, I feel there may be some people who are at this point clutching their heads in their hands and going, "Oh, no, poetry." And I understand that. I mean, if you do that, if that's how you feel, it's not for me. I'm willing to bet that there's a bad English teacher responsible for that. Somewhere on the borders of your mind is the unrested shade of an English teacher who made you feel that you were dumb at poetry, or you couldn't do it, or she read the poem out and then you adjust your first glimmerings of an answer and she'd say, "Wrong!" You know, and the kind of, actually, the Texas poet, Billy Collins, has a great description of this bad approach to poetry. One of his poems, he says about this, he says, her idea of how to do poetry was to tie the poem to a chair and beat it with a hose pipe till it confessed what it meant. But he says, by contrast, Billy Collins says, "Oh no, I wanted to put my ear up to the murmuring hive of the poem and wonder what music the innumerable bees of its words, what honey they were making." Or another way, he says, I wanted to see the poem as like a canoe I could step into and untie it and see where it took me. Very different approaches, right? So I can perform a minor exorcism now. I can say, if the unrested shade, if the ghost of that bad English teacher who made you feel that poetry is not for you is still lingering somewhere with her forbidding finger in the corner of your minds, I say to that unrested shade, "Begone, go to the place appointed for you and never return." So that's that teacher in permanent detention now, and it's playtime. So we're going to have quite a bit of poetry in the course of this, and I've given it you on a sheet. I think at one point the middle page was missing, but hopefully you've all been given your middle pages now. You don't need to look at the sheet just yet, but the point is it's there for you. You can make notes on it. You can't make notes on an overhead projector. So it's there for you, and maybe tonight, just a word or a phrase, one thing will strike you. Stay with it. Work with it. I once interviewed, 2002, I interviewed the poet Seamus Heaney, the Nobel laureate, and we were talking about when is a poem a poem. You know, it's not a poem when it's flat on the page. Nobody's reading it. It's not a poem quite if it's just read silently. It starts to be a poem when it's breathed into being. It starts to wake up and live off the page. But Heaney said a poem is really a poem when you're not actually reading it, but a poem has gone so deeply into you that you may not have learnt it all by heart. Maybe it's just a phrase. But a phrase from a poem comes when you're not thinking about that at all, when you're in some dilemma, you're in a conversation, you're looking at a sunrise, you're poised between two possible paths, and a phrase from the poem comes and clarifies things for you, shows you what's the case. That's when the poem is a poem. And Heaney summed it up by saying he didn't know if anybody would remember any of his poems by heart, at which point I was putting my hand up. I know a lot of them by heart. But he said, even if it's just phrases, and this is how he summed it up, he said, I hope that poetry offers phrases that feed the soul. And that's my hope for everything I say tonight, that somewhere in here there'll be some phrases that feed the soul. And if there are, then that's more than enough. So we're going to talk about the poetic imagination and the kingdom of God, what poetry and Christianity, and particularly the teachings of Jesus about the kingdom, might have in common, how they might need each other. So let's start with the poetry. Let's just go to basics here and try and find out what poetry is and how the poetic imagination works. Now, we don't have to mess around with middle management here. We can go straight to the top. We can ask Shakespeare, because Shakespeare very handily gave us a fabulous account of how the poetic imagination works. Quite early in his career, in the very playful play, Midsummer Night's Dream. And I've given you the whole of a speech by a character called Duke Theseus, who's the Duke of Athens. And I've given you the whole speech just for context, but I'm not going to... The great thing about this passage is they're discussing about whether you can trust imaginative people, whether the imagination might be a truth-bearing faculty or not. And ostensibly, Theseus is saying, oh, no, you don't trust them. You know, the lunatic, the lover, and the poet of imagination all compact. You know, I'm a practical chap. I don't believe this stuff. And he dismisses the lunatic and the lover in a couple of lines. But when he gets to the poet, he's still trying to say, oh, you needn't worry about poetry. But Shakespeare slips into the dismissal an account of poetry that is so luminous that he ends up putting his best lines about poetry into the mouth of a hostile witness. So I'll give you he is trying to dismiss it. He says, lovers and madmen have such seething brains, such shaping fantasies that apprehend more than cool reason ever comprehends. Interesting, isn't it? 2 words for knowing. Apprehend and comprehend. We'll come back to those. That apprehend more than cool reason ever comprehends. The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. One sees more devils than vast hell can hold, that is the madman. The lover, all as frantic, sees Helen's beauty in a brow of Egypt. You kind of want to freeze the frame there and say, Theseus, you're talking to your fiancée on the night before your wedding, and you're saying all that lovey-dovey stuff, forget it, the girl's probably ugly, he doesn't realize it. Like, you're in a hole, Theseus, stop digging. But, you know, he blusters on. So he's just dismissed, you see. So the madman sees this, the lover's all as frantic. Then suddenly comes the line about the poet, the lines. And this is the core, this is what I want to take you to. You'll feel the change of tone. The poet's eye, in fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. And as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Such tricks hath strong imagination that if it would but apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy. You see, the poet gets rather more lines than the lunatic and the lover. So, ostensibly he's trying to say, I don't believe it. But actually he gives a great account of poetry. And let's see what he says about it. We'll just take the lines from The Poet's Eye in Fine Frenzy Rolling down to a local habitation and a name. So it starts with the poet's eye. It starts with vision. It's about seeing. It's about how you can see, how much you can see. And it's about vision in the deeper sense of that word. It's about a clarifying of vision. Later on, Coleridge was to say that his aim with Wordsworth's in poetry was to awaken the mind's attention and remove the film of familiarity to let us see afresh. So what does the poet see? Well, everything. These are the good old days when poetry was allowed to be about the main things in life and about the joys of heaven and earth. And it wasn't just wry, acerbic, unrhymed little footnotes on life, or another odd adventure in the little world of me. This was when poetry was on the page. So, the glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. One way, of course, of saying heaven to earth to heaven, is to mean everything. The heavens, I believe in one God, the creator of the heavens and the earth, of all things visible and invisible. So it's comprehensive. But there's something about the double trajectory of the glance. There's one glance, perhaps one kind of poetry, that starts at heaven and comes down to earth, brings it down to earth. And there's another kind of poetry that begins with what you know and then opens up the heavens. So we'll come back to that. Maybe there's some relation to the double repetition of heaven to earth, earth to heaven, with the double repetition of apprehend, comprehend, before and after this bit. If it apprehends more than cool reason ever comprehends, if it would but apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy. So maybe there's something going on. If you just to think about the two words, apprehend and comprehend, because it might be quite helpful for us here. They're both words about ways of knowing. And the prehend bit, we've got some serious classicists in the room tonight, so I've got to be careful on my classical derivations. But as far as I know, the prehend is about being able to get hold of something. So I remember being told when I was at school that there were certain monkeys that had a prehensile tail, which meant they could actually pick stuff up with it, which would be incredibly useful, actually, but especially if you have a pipe and a pint and a cup of... Anyway. So my reading of these words is that if you can apprehend something, you've got a bit of an apprehension of it. You can reach out and touch a bit of it, but you can't get your mind around the whole thing. Whereas if you comprehend something, you understand it comprehensively, you get your mind all the way around it. Though, of course, to completely comprehend something, it's got to be smaller than your mind. If there's something greater than your mind, if there's some mystery, then you're always going to be apprehending more. Maybe we can sort of think of heaven apprehend and earth comprehend. We see the visible things. In fact, of course, the creed goes, things, all things. So that's all very well. That's what the poet is going to do. But how does the poet do it? What is the actual operation of the poetic imagination that makes the poetry happen? Well, now we get to the absolutely central line in this entire thing. The poet's eye and fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. But how do we bring them together? Whether the twain shall meet. Here it is. And as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes, gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Look at that. What is the imagination doing? The main verb for the imagination there is bodies. You normally use bodies as a noun, but this is bodies as a verb in the present continuous, giving a body to something, embodying, bodying forth. Look, now, here's a little thing I don't know. I mean, we're in a university here, so maybe we've got some folk here who've had the misfortune to suffer reading literary theory of one kind or another. But, certainly even when I was an undergraduate, when we were learning how to do literary criticism, there are always certain jargon words that you had to use to prove you'd read the critical books, and like you'd get the tick in the margin if you used that jargon word. They're all different now. The intertextuality is the jargon word. But back in my day, the big jargon word we were all taught to use in our essays was juxtaposition. Fabulous. And it was a bit disappointing to discover that it just meant just next to, just abutting up to. But check out, so this now officially becomes a Cambridge lecture because I'm going to use the word juxtaposition here, guys. So check out the juxtaposition of the words imagination and bodies. They're from completely different registers. They each have a penumbra of connotation and suggestion, which we, in our folly, would split apart, rather like earth and heaven, but which the poet brings together. What does imagination do? Imagination does not disappear into a airy-fairy, flimsy-whimsy. No, it looks for a good, solid, substantial, knowable, seeable, comprehensible body. Now, if I was the kind of lecturer who does that mawkish and embarrassing thing of splitting the audience into two groups and then assigning them little wordplay games where they talk to their neighbours, I just hate that. I remember I was in a lecture like that in the 80s once, and he said, I want you all into groups, and we're all, must do what the lecturer says. And he says, I want you to tell the person next to you the most personal thing about yourself that you can think of. Oh, God, we all cringing, And then he said, now I want the person who is there to tell us all about it, Anyway, so if I was that kind of lecturer, I could, in theory, split you up into two at this point. And I could assign the word imagination over here. And I could I'm not going to do this, don't worry. I could assign the word bodies over here, right? And we could have a little word association, free word association thing. What's associated with imagination? What's associated with bodies? And my guess is that bodies over here, depending on how your day started, how old you are, who you're sitting next to, it might be glorious willowy shapes and rippling muscles and six-packs and sturdy jawlines, or it might be aches and pains and blood and sweat and tears, whatever. But it would be kind of in that zone. And you might think of heavy bodies and low bodies. Meantime, the imagination folk, I'm just guessing, this is kind of unicorns and rainbows and, diaphanous things in the clouds and portals to magical worlds. And great, wonderful. But we'd be drawing from different clusters. Shakespeare says no. He says the whole purpose of the imagination is to find a body, to embody, to find a form for something that we otherwise couldn't have known. Imagination bodies forth the form. Form is another important word. Form, shape. We get three words which actually visual artists love and sculptors love. We have body, form, shape. Imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown. The poet's pen turns them to shapes. So the whole idea is to take the thing that was invisible, the thing that was only apprehended, the glimpse of heaven, the shimmering thing, and find an emblem, a symbol, a seeable, particular, visible thing that bodies it forth. And of course, Shakespeare does that all the time in that very play, Midsummer Night's Dream. He has these two imaginary bodies of these, Oberon and Titania, the king, fairy king and fairy queen, and yet through them, the earth herself, the seasons of the earth, all kinds of things are embodied. He gives you Falstaff, who's the embodiment of a whole kind of long tradition of self-deprecatory wit and self-indulgence in alehouses that goes in, or he gives you Puck, this lithe, bright spirit, or Ariel, that's something about the very nature of the imagination itself. So imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown. The poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Now, it's not airy nothing, actually. That's a bit of a sly one from Theseus. Just because a thing is unknown doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It may not be known because we've not yet found the form by which it's known. And I've had scientists discuss this passage with me and say this is what happens with us when we test and we have a new model. We have a lightning idea, we have a paradigm shift. We see the shape and the form first, and then we do the math. that happened in a pub I frequent in Cambridge called the Eagle and Child, where Crick and Watson had been doing all these complicated looks at molecular biology and trying to figure out how these patterns of these large molecules that were responsible for transmitting our characteristics. And they couldn't figure out how to do it. And they went and had a pint, and suddenly they came up with the idea of the double helix strand of DNA. And now you can still go into the pub and buy a pint of DNA. They name the beer after it. So you need the form. And then when you have the form and the habitation, you begin to woo the knowledge into it. And you find it's interesting. It works not just with poetry. Now, I actually think, let's illustrate this with some more contemporary poets. I think we can go back to the two trajectories now. The poet's eye in a fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. I think different kinds of poets work in different ways like that. For example, I think T.S. Eliot is a poet whose glance goes from heaven to earth. T.S. Eliot has these moments of apprehension, these moments of lucidity, which are wordless. This is true of the early Eliot just as much as the post-conversion. And then he finds one way after another. He keeps trying different. He actually says in one of his early poems, I must borrow every changing shape to find expression. Dance like a dancing bear, chatter like an ape. And a wonderful one, I remember reading it in my angst-ridden teenage years. I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. I know how you feel, He's bodied it forth. And even in the later mystical poetry, he'll try one thing after another, one image after another. Yes, it's this, but it's not quite this. Let me try again. He interrupts himself in mid-poem and says, that was a way of putting it. So he starts there, and then he comes down here. And he's successful. He knows how to do that. But there's a lot of sort of post-Eliot poetry, what C.S. Lewis called Eliotic poetry, where people don't body it forth. They've got some weird thing that they can't understand. And by the time you finish the poem, you can't understand it either. So it hasn't worked. It hasn't made the connection. But when the connection is made, you've got a poem. Now, there are other poets who do it the other way around. Their glances from earth to heaven. They take something really familiar, something you know about. They describe it incredibly well, so it's really vivid in your mind and particular. And then as you read, it suddenly opens up. And it becomes a habitation. It becomes a place where experiences you want to have again, intuitions you've had, come and find their root. So a classic example of that would be, again, I've mentioned his name already, the poet Seamus Heaney, the late, great Irish Nobel laureate. So probably his most famous poem, certainly the first poem that he thought, I've got a poem here. It's not just a mental exercise. This is an actual poem. And it's the opening poem of his first collection, a collection called Death of a Naturalist. And you probably know this poem. It's called Digging. And it's about digging. So fine. So the poem begins, between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests snug as a gun. So it's a poem about, he's sitting in an upstairs room trying to write a poem and he's stuck. And he gets distracted. And what he's distracted by is the harsh sound of a spade on gravelly ground. And he looks out the window and he sees his father's straining rump. I'm sure his dad didn't thank him for that. He sees his father's straining rump where his dad is digging potatoes, right? And suddenly the poem becomes obsessively interested in digging potatoes. And it's incredible. He talks about then his grandfather digging turf, going down and down for the good stuff. And he talks about the cuts through the peat and the squelch and slap and the feel of the lug of the spade against your knee. And you're reading, you're about 15 lines into this poem and you're saying, great Seamus, I know potatoes are important in Ireland and I like turf and I've done a bit of digging myself. This is great, but and my dad dug, my granddad cut more turf on Toner's bog than wait. And then suddenly, he talks about him going down and down and cutting through the living roots and going down and down for the good stuff. Suddenly the poem turns. And having honoured his father and his grandfather as labourers on the land, Heaney says, but I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it. And you go, oh my goodness. And you go back to the top of the poem. And you realize that every one of these descriptions of different kinds of digging and what the digging to give your family nurture and nourishment, to nourish those who come after you, how the children would come behind him and pick up the potatoes, loving their cool, hard feelings, and the going down for the good stuff and the cutting through. Every one of these kinds of digging is telling you something you really need to know and only half knew about writing. Everything is both about digging and writing. But he makes you start with the digging. He doesn't rush to some abstraction. He never explains to you why those are things are about digging and writing. He just says, I'll dig with my pen, and leaves it to you. In fact, the first thing you do is you dig through the poem again and find the good stuff. So that's a poet whose glance starts from earth and goes to heaven. So, we'll rest that there and we'll say this is a great passage about what poetry is, and it's helped me enormously, both in my practice as a poet and in my practice as a literary critic, and just a genial reader of poetry. I can figure out what kind of poem this is. I can be alert to the way this poet's imagination bodies forth the form of something I might not have known if they hadn't given me the image. And there's some amazing images you get given by poets. There's a poem by George Herbert called Prayer, which is only 14 lines, and it's got 26 brilliant bodyings forth or images of what prayer is. So, fine. Now, for a long time, that's all I thought this passage was about. And it was only much later when I read literature at Cambridge as an undergraduate. I went off and taught high school for a while, and then I felt God was calling me to the priesthood. So I came back to Cambridge and did theology. And having done these two subjects in the same university, it occurred to me that they were not talking to each other. And I felt a huge amount of literature needed, people were doing literary criticism without any notion of the Bible at all or any notion of the theology that lay behind it. We needed, but frankly, some of the theology was terrible because it was so abstract, so sort of falsely syllogistic, so disembodied, that I felt it had forgotten. So I thought it would be good to bring the two subjects into conversation. And I started writing a book called Faith, Hope and Poetry, subtitled Theology and the Poetic Imagination. So I thought, let's just get started, just what I've done with you now, literally just what I've done. I'll go back to that Shakespeare passage, just so I can establish what the poetic imagination is and how it works and how it bodies forth. And then I'll get onto the theology. But because I was sitting with the frame of theology or open, with the door into theology open, even in my mind, I reread this very passage, glanced from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and I thought, what does this remind me of? Well, the creed, creator of the heavens and the earth, of all things invisible, but there's something else, there's something about how do we get from the heaven and the heavenly? And then I came across this thing, bodies forth. I thought, I know what this is riffing on. I know what lies behind this. And certainly Shakespeare had access to it. And it's actually the prologue to John's Gospel. If you think about the prologue to John's Gospel, so, when you're reading that, you go, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. Without him, all things were made by him. Without him was not anything made that was made. And if you're struggling, as I was, to read it in Greek as well, you're kind of going, you think, I know this is great philosophy. I know that the Logos, it's all, but it's all kind of up there. I can't see it. It's going round and round and round in the world of invisible. I certainly don't comprehend it all, but I'm kind of apprehending it. You're going on like that for several verses, and suddenly, verse 14 comes in and comes to your rescue. All this Logos stuff going on, light, life, creation, you're up there. And then suddenly, verse 14, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory. We beheld his glory. Glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. It's not diminished glory. It's all of that bodied forth. And I suddenly thought, I wonder, of course, Midsummer Night's Dream is set in Athens, BC. It's pretty peculiar Athens because it's got the Parthenon, but it's got a nice little patch of enchanted magical English woodland up behind the Parthenon, but never mind. So playfully, he's offering through the mouth of this pagan BC Greek character an account of poetry that echoes the great moment of the incarnation. And maybe Shakespeare is suggesting that the reason why we, who are made in the image of God, made in the image of a maker, long to find a way of bodying forth our inexpressible or only apprehended things. So other people, and that body it's a body, but then it's a house. It's saying, look, I'm going to put my stuff into this house. It's not going to be airy-fairy. It's got an address, and the address is this poem. And you can walk through the doors of this poem. And you can come into this poem that I've made and find the things. And maybe it'll be a habitation for more than I knew. Maybe other truths will come and inhabit my poem. And you'll come to my poem and find them. And we know that, don't we? We go back again to the same poem or the same work of art, and there's more and more in the habitation. So, of course, in the Gospel of John, the Word was made flesh, was bodied forth. All the invisible, heaven itself bodied forth into the earth. And we beheld his glory. And then it's a kind of interesting thing. The first question that's asked of Jesus, whom we're told is the eternal Word, in John's Gospel, is, Master, where are you staying? Magister, and of course the word for staying, habitas, is the word from which we get habitation. Master, where is your habitation? And Jesus, of course, replies, come and see. And come and see is the echo all the way through. Jesus says to the first disciples, come and see. Each of them says to the person that they... So we get it classically in the story of, I think, Philip or Simon, who comes to Nathaniel and finds... And Nathaniel is like the been there, done that, bought the T-shirt, And Nathaniel pretends to have a kind of blasé world weariness about him and, satirical scorn. So, remember, we found the Messiah. Oh, yeah, sure, who's that? Well, it's Jesus of Nazareth. Kind of like, Nazareth? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Come on, guys. Nazareth is so last year. But of course, this is a complete facade. As is often the case, I found with some of the students I work with, there's a worldly facade and there's a deep spiritual life going on hidden underneath. So you remember, Nathaniel says, okay, I'll come along. And before he sees Jesus, Jesus sees him. And he says, oh, there's a true Israelite without guile. And the Nathanael, Israel thing's going on. So Nathanael's a bit freaked out by this. And he says to Jesus, how do you know me? And again, it's about seeing, the poet's eye. And Jesus says, before you saw me, I saw you sitting under the fig tree. You go, what? So if you're reading your intertestamental works and your Old Testament prophecies, the idea that at the time when the Messiah comes and then every man will sit under his vine and under his fig tree. It's and it's Jesus saying, I know you've got an inner prayer life because I've seen it. Don't give me this Nazareth thing. Anyway, so he looks at Nathanael and there's a moment of complete conversion. It's almost like it's a lovely word that the Buddhists and Hindus use, which is darshan. Darshan is when the God glances at you and doesn't have to say anything, and you get it. And that's happens sometimes in Christianity too. It happens to Nathanael. Nathanael goes, you are the Messiah, you are the Son of God. He gets, it takes Peter 3 years of blundering to, and like getting the wrong answer in every possible multiple choice test until he gets it right. Nathanael is there. And then Jesus says to him, did you say all these things about me because I said I saw you? Then he says, you will see greater things. And in the Greek, it goes from the singular to the plural. So that's not just Nathanael, it's all of us. And this is very cool. I think this still relates back to this passage in Shakespeare, because Shakespeare knows the whole of John's Gospel, of course. So, you will see greater things. What does he then say? He says to Nathanael, you will see the heavens opened and the angels of God ascending and descending. Notice the two trajectories. The angels of God ascending and descending upon. And you can imagine Nathanael at this moment. He's going, oh, I know this one. He's like the kid at the back of the class. Pick me, I know this one. He thinks, he knows that Jesus is going to say, you will see the angels of God ascending and descending upon Jacob's ladder. Because that's the story, right? And Jacob changes his name to Israel, and Jesus is just called Nathanael, a true Israelite. So see what you did there. So he's going to go, you're going to say, on Jacob's ladder, my ancestor, in the past, in the good old days, when stuff like that happened. Not like now, when nothing interesting happens. Jesus carries on. You will see the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. It's like a hidden I am saying, I am Jacob's ladder. I am precisely what happens when heaven to earth and earth to heaven finally get connected. Jacob's ladder was about me. How awesome is this place has become how awesome is this person. But there we are. Nathanael has totally got it. But it is a bodying forth. And what the eternal word and God the Father does is he takes all of love, all of heaven, none of which we could remotely come to. Eye has not seen, and ear has not heard, nor hath it entered into the imagination of man what they say. But if heaven were to reveal itself, so there's a bodying forth. So I was kind of sitting there with my mind slightly blown in my study, thinking I was just going to summarize what poetry is about, and realizing that this was this gentle thing. And do you know, I had the folly of thinking that I'd really thought this up originally. I had, but about a year later, I was rereading C.S. Lewis's fantastic book, Reflections on the Psalms. And he's talking about why poetry in the middle of the Bible, what is distinctive about what poetry has to offer as opposed to prose. And he talks about bodying forth. And then he says, and I'm quoting Lewis directly, he says, every poem is a little incarnation, which is Lewis saying in one sentence what I've taken about 30 or 40 minutes to tell you so about. But Lewis gives you the exact. So that got me very excited, and it got me feeling about, it gave me a clue about why, frankly, some church discourse and some theology is so bad and so off-putting, because it is discarnate. It pays no attention to the actual real flesh and blood bodying forth. It doesn't have that extraordinarily empathetic attention to everybody in their particular situation and their blood and their sweat and their tears, which Shakespeare can do, but which we seem to have lost the art of doing. And in fact, my sense that theology needed to recover poetry, I think poetry to some degree needs to recover theology, but I certainly think theology needs to recover poetry. I found a poem there's a Scottish mystical poet called Edwin Muir, whom I really admire, and he has a poem called The Incarnate One. I've given you some lines for it. I mean, I'll just, you'll be able to read the whole thing to you, but it has got, in my view, the best description of bad church ever, right? And the best description is down there in the second verse. The word made flesh is here made word again. A word made word in flourish and arrogant crook. See there? King Calvin with his iron pen. And God, 3 angry letters in a book. And there, the logical hook on which the mystery is impaled and bent into an ideological argument. Golly, the poem could have ended there. I mean, disastrous. Luckily, if it had ended there, it would have been by Philip Larkin rather than Edward Muir. But it goes on, and this is what it goes on to say. It's on the next. There's better gospel in man's natural tongue. And truer sight was theirs outside the law, who saw the far side of the cross among the archaic peoples in their ancient or in ignorant wonder, saw the wooden cross tree on the bare hillside, not knowing that there a God suffered and died. Somebody really looking at the cross without the theology might have more awe and wonder than the person whose theology has somehow anesthetized them from dealing with the flesh and blood. You can look at the earlier part of that poem as well, about the sense that what we're doing is betraying the incarnate one. We're unmaking the incarnate one. Later on in that poem, he talks about abstract calamity. He says, the fleshless word growing. This is before the internet, right? This is before we just totally discarnated ourselves and ceased to be present in anywhere where we are, because we're simultaneously half present in 100 other places. Even then he was saying the fleshless word growing will bring us down. Pagan and Christian man alike will fall, the auguries say. The white and black and brown, the merry and the sad, theorist, lover, all invisibly will fall. Abstract calamity. Save for those who can build their cold empire on the abstract man. There's a lot to tease out there. I kind of quite like to read this with the tech bros, but I'm not sure kind of how much of a welcome I would get. But there we go, their cold empire on the abstract man. All of that, I just wanted to make the case for the imagination. And what I'm really trying to do is make the case for the imagination as a truth-bearing faculty in general. But then I want specifically to appeal to Christians and say, you should be friendly with poetry, because the bodying forth that poetry is doing is actually something that at least echoes and I think actually participates in the great bodying forth, which is the incarnation of the eternal word into flesh and blood. Now, the reason for making the case for the imagination is not, and I have to wind up here soon, but I'll finish. It's not because I think I don't care about reason and I only care about imagination. I'm not fleeing into unreason. I'm not turning my back on or abandoning the really great things that have been achieved since the Enlightenment by the exercise of dispassionate, discursive, analytical reason, right? I mean, I depend on modern medicine. I trust the engineers who put together the plane that flew me over here. I'm not anti-science. I think the very idea of opposing imagination and reason is itself a problem. I think reason alone is poorer for having lost its imaginative, form-finding, model-making capacity. And I think imagination, unhinged from what we can know through the reason, can go to some very dark places indeed. And we need to speak of a baptism of the imagination. But we all grew up, we're like children of divorced parents, and we can still hear our parents arguing in our heads, and like reason and imagination should be married. In fact, that's the plot of the marriage of Theseus and Hippolyta. If you read on in the bit I gave, Theseus is trying to represent cool reason, and Hippolyta is saying, no, there's something that transfigures our minds together and grows to something of great constancy. So and the point is they're getting married. About a generation after Shakespeare had arranged the marriage, various philosophers from Descartes onwards arranged the divorce and said, no. Imagination is just flimsy, whimsy, fancy. It's just subjective. This is objective, and we had the thing. So the sense of being stuck in this dilemma where your imagination was capable of bodying forth really true things, but all your school teachers were telling you no. Okay? Here's what C.S. Lewis said. He's writing in the 1950s in Surprised by Joy, but he's looking back to how it was for him as an ardent young atheist philosophy don. He taught philosophy first before he did English. But he was a modern philosopher with a guilty pleasure. Well, he actually had several guilty pleasures, but the guilty pleasure in question was mythology and poetry. So this is what he says. The two hemispheres of, you've got this on the sheet. The two hemispheres of my mind were in the sharpest contrast. On the one side, a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth. On the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I loved, I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. Does that ring any bells? I think we were all brought up this. It's a kind of, the episteme in Greek means to know, so epistemology is about how we know stuff. It's the study of knowing, right? So I think we live with a kind of epistemological apartheid, right? So we have privileged mainstream economy, rational reason, glib and shallow rationalism over here. And then, of course, you've got an imagination there. Why don't you go and play quietly in the corner? So we've got this separate development. We've got these little Bantu stands of weird artists doing their thing. But, of course, it's got no purchase on reality. It's got no connection. That's the way we were brought up. And as a result, our analysis of the world was wrong because we missed its mystery and its meaning. All we got were its quantities and not its qualities. But our imagination, unhinged and, from reason, was... See the problem? Now, C.S. Lewis wrote this in Surprised by Joy. It's published in the 1950s. And he's talking about how it was for him in the 1920s. So you might reasonably say, yeah, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? I mean, he's had 30 years. Do we have any contemporary records from Lewis himself, writing at the time that he's describing here? And the answer is yes, we do. I was once asked, which was a great joy, to write the chapter on Lewis as a poet for the Cambridge Companion C.S. Lewis. And some of Lewis's best poems were never published in his lifetime at all. And some of them were actually salvaged from the fire where his brother Warney was placing them by Walter Hooper, the ardent young American secretary to whom we owe so much for rescuing a lot of Lewis's stuff. There's a poem which Walter Hooper, in his edition of 1964, called Reason. But I had reason to believe that it couldn't have been called Reason. And in fact, eventually I had a conversation with Walter Hooper and he confessed, he just didn't have a title. Reason was in the first line and he thought it was reasonable to call it Reason. But as it's a poem about reason and imagination and the relations between the two of them as ways of knowing, actually calling the poem Reason, which is what it's called in the book, unbalances the poem. It unbalances the delicate poise. So it's better not to give it a title. If I were to give it a title, I would call it Who, because he's calling... So now this is an astonishing poem. I figured it's clearly pre-conversion. I figured it might be around 1928, 1929. Alistair McGrath, who's written two very good books on Lewis recently, thinks it might be as early as 1926, in which case the question, the dilemma, the tension that's adumbrated in this poem was a question, a dilemma, and a tension that he was living with for 5 or 6 years before it. So he does a brilliant thing, talking about bodying forth the form of things unknown. It's not unrelated to Midsummer Night's Dream, this poem, because it's set in Athens. And in the poem, he asks us to imagine our own soul as like Athens. And he then asks us to think about the different kinds of... There's a great book about... And we all know about the Greeks and rationalism. We all know about Euclid and wonderful logical reasoning by Socrates and the dialogues of Plato and the science that's given us by Aristotle, and that's really important. But there was a great book called The Greeks and the Irrational. And then we get the Eleusinian mysteries, and we get the great tragedies, and we get the poetry. Greece did both magnificently. So he asks us to imagine our souls as being kind of like ancient Athens. And there's the Parthenon up there. There's Athene, the goddess of reason. But there's something warm and fertile and imaginative going on below. So here's the poem. I think it's an amazingly good poem. And it certainly bodies forth things for me that I couldn't have otherwise quite put my finger on. Set on the soul's acropolis, the reason stands, a virgin armed, commercing with celestial light. And he who sins against her has defiled his own virginity. No cleansing makes his garment white, so clear is reason. Let's pause there. If you know something is true, and it's demonstrably true that 2 and 2 is 4. But it would be more convenient for you if on this particular evening 2 and 2 was 5. And you go ahead and say it's 5. You destroy the good of your own intellect. You defile your own virginity. If you stop following a clear case of what is actually the truth and the case, then you become less and less capable of distinguishing between truth and falsehood every time you pretend a falsehood is a truth, because it would be politically or socially inconvenient not to do so. You sever the links between yourself and your reason, which is part of what makes you human. One of the things that keeps Lewis from Christianity for a while is that he doesn't think it's demonstrably the case, or he thinks it might be unreasonable to believe in it. It's only when he becomes aware that it might be reasonable to believe in it, and he gives us many reasons, that it's so. He who sins against her has defiled his own virginity. No cleansing makes his garment white. So clear is reason. But how dark imagining, warm, dark, obscure, and infinite daughter of night. Dark is her brow. The beauty of her eyes with sleep is loaded, and her pains are long, and her delight. Tempt not Athene, wound not in her fertile pains Demeter, nor rebel against her mother right. Oh, who will reconcile in me both maid and mother? Who make in me a concord of the depth and height? Who make imagination's dim exploring touch ever report the same as intellectual sight? Then could I truly say and not deceive. Then could I wholly say that I believe. Isn't that an astonishing poem? I mean, the way he bodies forth or figures the way our reason actually works and the way our imagination actually works is really brilliant. And this kind of stargaze, the beauty of the order of the heavens, the geometry of the Parthenon, it's all perfect for reason. And to the clarity of reason, the utter clarity of a geometrical demonstration, that is utterly clear. There's no room for ambiguity. Sight is really good there. But then he has light and sight, and then he has a kind of warm, wombing, fertile darkness and touch for the imagination. And we have both the sense of touch and the sense of sight, have we not? God gave us both of those for a reason. So wound not in her fertile pains Demeter. I love the description of Demeter, who is the imagination here, that it's to do with sleep, to do with dream. Her pains are long and her delight. There's the sense of labor pains there, isn't there? There's the sense that our imagination allows us to feel pain, and that can be a terrible thing. We can have nightmares. But there's also the sense of the artist taking pains over what they'd create. Her pains are long and her delight. Then comes the great cry for help. Who will reconcile in me both maid and mother? Who make a concord of the depth and height? Who make imagine it? You're hearing him say this. Oh, come on, Jack, he's just behind you. Like, check out the language you're using. Like, this is almost a riff on Ephesians 3, isn't it? That you may know the length and breadth and height and depth, and know the love of God which passes knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of Christ. Yeah, and then who has a ministry of reconciliation? Whose entire point is that he should make a concord of the depth and height? And then, to be frank, who came into the world through somebody who was both a maid and a mother? So, well, we know the rest of the story. We know how he stayed with this for however long it was, how he carried on with these two hemispheres in sharpest contrast, how he went out for a walk in September of 1931 around Addison's Walk in Cambridge, having kind of moved to a sort of abstract theism, but not Christianity. How they got onto the subject of myths, and especially the subject of the dying and rising God, and how Tolkien was, in full flow, and how Lewis said, yeah, but the problem with myths is that they're lies. Even though they're lies breathed through silver, they're not real, they're not true, I can't trust them. And Tolkien famously says they're not lies. And he ends up writing a whole poem called Mythopoeia to Lewis to say, the heart of man is not compound of lies, but draws its wisdom from the only wise. And so after that, they get onto the subject of Christianity. And Lewis says, it's all very well. I might be persuaded that some historical guy, maybe he was raised from the dead. Well, bully for him, it doesn't make any difference to me. And, so he lived and died, 2,000 years ago, big deal, so what? And Tolkien's going, I don't believe you. So you love nothing more than the myth of the dying and rising God. You totally get all the beautiful things it means that a God would suffer, that a God would die, that a God would rise, that it's to do with the planting and the sowing and the reaping and the sun setting and rising, and all these things movingly come together, this promise. And Lewis said, yeah, of course, I love that stuff, if only it were true. And Tolkien says, don't you get it yet? This myth you love but could never trust because it wasn't real has been made real. It has become true in history. It happens under... But it doesn't cease to be a myth in that beautiful, big, imaginative, bodying forth resonance sense, just because it's also... But you get the full language of the cosmic death and resurrection, but you also get these weird historical details, like when Quirinius was governor of Syria, or under Pontius Pilate, like... If you want to be historical, check out the names of a couple of hideous political apparatchiks, who would never otherwise make the history books. But check it out, So, and as they're saying this, you can almost feel the two hemispheres of Lewis's brain quivering and getting ready to come together on this satisfying thing. And equally, if you like, his inner goddesses, his Athene and his Demeter being reconciled. Now, I'm sure that if you talk to Lewis on the right day about Jesus, he probably would be able to use the language we're used to using in church, like he's my personal savior. I'm not saying. But he's also solving a massive epistemological problem. That's really important as well. He is healing our way of knowing and our way of seeing. He's allowing the reason and imagination to come together. I can respond to him both imaginatively and rationally, because, of course, he is the source of both my capacities of reason and imagination. Now, once you've grasped that, I must stop now. Once you've grasped that, you can then begin to find poetry to be a way of exploring bits of theology that have become dry and desiccant for you. And I've given you two poems, one by the great Anglican priest-poet R.S. Thomas, called Because I Was Talking About the Kingdom. It's a beautiful poem called The Kingdom. And then I've given you a poem of mine called Beatitudes, which you can perhaps read at your leisure. But maybe I'll just finish with R.S. Thomas's The Kingdom. This is one of the most beautiful bodyings forth of the paradoxes and reversals. And you need poetry to get your mind around these paradoxes and reversals of the... So, here's what R.S. Thomas says about the kingdom. The kingdom, it's a long way off. But inside it, there are quite different things going on. Festivals at which the poor man is king. Notice what he does with the line endings here. The punch, the kind of reversal always comes just after the end of the line. You kind of pause and then it's coming in. Festivals at which the poor man is king and the consumptive is healed. Mirrors in which the blind look at themselves and love looks at them back. And industry is for mending the bent bones and the minds fractured by life. It's a long way off, but to get there takes no time. And admission is free if you purge yourself of desire and present yourself with your need only and the simple offering of your faith, green as a leaf. Fantastic image at the end there. Sometimes people who believe things are called green or naive, but maybe they're green as a leaf. Anyway, I'm going to stop there because I've overrun my time. But I hope it's given you some sense of why poetry might be important for theology. Thank you. I think the idea was to have some Q&A. I can't. Is that right?
Yeah. So we're going to have a couple of mic runners that are going to be out here with microphones. Please wait till you get a microphone so everyone else can hear you. It's a large room. While you're thinking of a question that you can ask Malcolm, we're just going to have 15 or 20 minutes here. I'm going to start with a question, Malcolm. Would you mind to read your poem for us there?
Okay.
Introduce it.
I'm
And
allowed
read it.
to
I don't want people asking
Okay.
for their money back.
So the last poem I gave you was my own poem, Beatitudes. And I was trying to think about how Christ himself, the poet, the eternal word through whom the poem of the cosmos is made, now the poet appears within his own poem, as though Shakespeare had walked on in the middle of Hamlet. And he tells us things which require the poetic imagination. And I'm thinking about the Beatitudes, which seem flatly to contradict the reason sometimes, Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. I mean, it's blindingly obvious that the meek are precisely the people who don't inherit the earth, because the unmeek and the pushy and the sharp-elbowed have already just shoved them aside. No, says Jesus, you haven't seen the end yet. They shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the poor. Most people are trying not to be poor. Blessed are the peacemakers. If you want to be really shouted at and maligned by both sides of an argument, just go in there and try and make peace. Just find the middle ground. But if you don't do it, who will? Blessed are the peacemakers. So anyway, I was trying to think about how do we get our mind around these blessings. Will the poetic imagination help me to enter into the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount? This is how it came out. I bless you who have spelt your blessing out and set this lovely lantern on a hill, lightening darkness and dispelling doubt by lifting for a little while the veil. For longing is the veil of satisfaction, and grief the veil of future happiness. I glimpse beneath the veil of persecution the coming kingdom's overflowing bliss. Oh, make me pure of heart and help me see amongst the shadows and amidst the morning the promised comforter, alive and free, the kingdom coming and the sun returning, that even in this pre-dawn dark, I might at once reveal and revel in your light. So that's the poem I'd intended to end with, so there you go. Okay. I think I can't
Just
see, so...
raise your hands and a microphone runner will find you.
A microphone will find you.
Hello.
Hello, where are you?
Over here.
Oh, great, hi.
Thank you so much. I had a question about, well, thank you because you gave us a nice way to ease the tensions between reason and imagination. And then you talked about the process of imagination, especially with the example from Shakespeare. But within imagination, we still don't know exactly what it is. And within imagination, there's a bunch of tensions. So my question is about within imagination, a lot of it has to do with the senses, the physical senses, and then something happens in the soul. And in the Shakespeare excerpt you gave us, we see that the poet's eye in fine frenzy rolling, and it makes me think of like in Greek tragedy when their eyes are rolling in frenzy. And that's the opposite of like in Matthew when he says, have a simplex oculus, have a single eye, and so you have the eye on the one hand, but in the ancient Greek before writing, it was just the word that was in the ear. And
I mean, just to pick up on that a little bit, because I'm not quite sure we got to the question there, but the thing is, you've got to remember in that Shakespeare passage that Shakespeare is doing two opposite things at the same time. The character is trying to denigrate poetry and saying it doesn't add to anything and it's just a frenzy. But Shakespeare, through the character, is trying to say, actually, there's more to this than you think. So you get this poet's eye in fine frenzy rolling. That's he's trying to say the poet is frenzied like the madman. But actually, Shakespeare then says, no, it gives to airy nothing a local habitat. But, you know, even airy nothing is a bit of a tricksy word, because he says the poet bodies forth the form of things unknown. Those are real things, but just unknown. And then by a kind of sleight of hand, Theseus turns things unknown to airy nothing. So I don't think, I mean, we have to distinguish between what Shakespeare is saying through the character and what the character is saying. But I do take the point that imagination, I'm making the case for the imagination as at least potentially a truth-bearing faculty. But I'm not saying that every imagination of every heart is a good thing or is in any way accurate or is not delusive. I mean, the person who's really thought this through is Coleridge. And Coleridge makes a distinction between what he calls imagination, capital I, and what he calls fancy, which he thinks is a lower thing. And the ability to just have a fantasy that satisfies our immediate ego, or even building a fantasy which prevents us from really seeing the damage we're doing to real people in the real world if we saw with a clear eye. Coleridge was saying that can be very destructive. But the answer to that is not emotionless rationalism. The answer is an empathetic imagination. So I would say, but like every good thing, I mean, Augustine says evil is not a thing in itself, it's a corruption of a good thing. And every good thing can be corrupted. And the better the thing is, the worse it is when it's corrupted. That's why corrupt religion, whether it's in a Christian form or any other, is particularly hideous in its effects on people. Because religion is itself a good thing. Therefore, I mean, Shakespeare, of course, says it perfectly, bodying it forth in an image, when he says, lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds. So I don't know if that answers all the things that you were saying there, but
my question was actually just about whether there's a lot of focus on seeing, but there's also hearing.
Yeah.
And then Demeter, right? It was the Athena versus Demeter was sight versus touch.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could talk about the other senses
okay,
and how the senses are gathered together.
So the hearing, I mean, I think all five senses are God-given, and all five senses are not only physical but spiritual. So I think there is a spiritual seeing and a spiritual hearing and a spiritual touching and a spiritual tasting. The old church fathers and the monastics used to speak of reading scripture to taste it with, it's an almost untranslatable term, palatum cordis, the palate of the heart, to taste it. So I think there is there are all of those senses. Now, I don't think, when Lewis makes the contrast between seeing, reason, touch, imagination, that's a metaphor for the moment. He's not elevating one against the other. But there are places in Scripture where seeing is used in a way to suggest that hearing has not been enough. When Job says, before I had heard of thee with the hearing of my ear, but now I see, that passage is clearly meant to say that he needed the revelation of sight as well as what he'd heard. And I think the distinction between hearing and seeing is actually very useful there, because I think we can all talk about our own progress in faith. As we get to hear about an idea, we kind of ruminate on it. But when we have an aha moment, I actually get that, we tend to say, now I see it. So I think there's a kind of sense of sight and clarity which has a sort of premium on it, provided we don't mix it up entirely with actual bodily sight. So in Romans 8, Jesus goes out of his way to find the quote-unquote disabled man, the blind man, and point out that this man can see better than the sighted Pharisees, who are in fact blind. So again, I think the senses provide us, as does everything that God has created. They're not only good in themselves, but they are capable of spiritual meaning and of emblems. So that would be the way. Thank you for asking that. Anybody else want to? Yeah? Is there somebody over there? Yep.
Yes. Is this on?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for uncovering for us in a manner that was, it's palatable, digestible. In fact, as a speaker, you come across as very empathic. And it is quite unusual to find people who are reasonably educated and retain that humility. So thank you. So the important thing I'm saying is that I think you've effectively been able to, for those of us who are not poets and such, we've been able to follow the argument you've made about this importance of challenging the epistemological divide between theology and poetry. And in 2026, I think I speak for so many of us, I'm in the arts. My fear as a believer is that often in today, 2026, the trajectory that you've described appears tonight to be one where theology is in great need of poetry. And I couldn't agree more. But I would suggest the other trajectory is so very vital to discuss next, how much poetry is in need of theology.
Oh, yeah,
you haven't avoided it.
No, but that would be, thank you. I mean, I think poetry is in need of theology.
Yes.
And that would be another talk.
Exactly.
But,
well, I can help you.
like,
I can help you
got?
do that one,
Yeah.
right? We can.
Yeah.
Several of us
Yeah.
here. This is what we do. But in 2026, so many of us, especially young people, are caught up in an aestheticization of life. They just become the replacement for religion.
Yeah.
I'm around these people, and whether it's theater, the arts, poetry, we have made that our new and our next church.
But I get that. I get that, and I get there being almost a danger of idolatry in a kind of aesthetic experience. But I have hope. I actually think, when I think about after I'd completely rejected the faith I was brought in, and I thought I was very thoroughly and systematically and scientifically atheist according to my own lights. But the thing that stopped me from being completely reductive was the experience of poetry. So poetry, it wasn't Christian poetry, it was Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, as it happens, and Keats wasn't a Christian. But something was a gift in that. And I think, the other thing I would say, I mean, I don't know whether I'm addressing a largely Christian audience here or not. I'm a Christian, so I'm naturally drawing the benefits that I feel a better epistemology, a reunion of faith and reason, of reason and imagination would have. But I think I could have this discussion with all kinds of people who didn't share my faith or of another different faith, but who said the split we're all living with, the split that's been imposed on us, frankly, not by religion, but by a combination of bad science and bad philosophy, that kind of dualism is a problem for all of us, frankly, whatever faith we're at. And obviously I speak as an adherent of one faith, but so I think this is a conversation that can be had more widely. But going back to your aesthetics thing, I'm very conscious that the rising generation to whom I've been chaplains find meaning primarily through the arts and often particularly through music. Constantly hearing music and the music. And I get that. I love music myself. And I think all these things, ultimately come from one who is the source of all goodness and truth and beauty, as Plato would have put it. So, but I also recognize that we can end up going round in circles in the shallows of whatever medium it is. And I'm always encouraging people, as it were, to swim upstream from the thing that they enjoy and try again to find the source, try to find where the beauty comes from, where the longing comes from. But you may start just with the aesthetic experience, and I would never put that down. So a chap called T.E. Hulme once famously said that, he was talking about romanticism, and I came back to some openness to the transcendence through the romantic poets. He said, romanticism is spilled religion. And Lewis quotes that somewhere and says, okay, but if all I can find for a moment are the drops that have fallen from the altar, because my perspective doesn't allow me to stand up yet to the altar and find where these spilled drops of religion came from, at least let me enjoy the drops, eh? Don't say you've got that wrong, so, don't have the experience. It may be that I will eventually find where that came from. and pass through the experience towards its source. And that may happen in all kinds of ways. I mean, I'll tell you a sort of, one of my favorite gospel stories, and it's done like an incident. Jesus is supposed to be on his way to some important centurion's house or something like that. And there's a crowd. And you remember the woman with the issue of blood touches the hem of Christ's garment. And she's healed. It didn't even touch him. She just touches the hem of his garment. And then she kind of, because she's had to live with, obviously it's horrible to be unclean and live with the issue of blood. She's used to just shyly disappearing. So she's going to disappear, and Jesus stops and says, someone touched me, and somebody comes and gets her. And suddenly she's restored completely. He calls her a daughter of Jerusalem. He totally makes her belong again. And I sometimes think, when all the beautiful liturgies that I was fortunate to participate in my college chapel and the 1662 prayer book, and that used to be the more ardent evangelical Christians among the Students' Union used to mock me and the chaplaincy as, oh, you're just churchianity, and this has nothing to do with the real Jesus. You've got to say this prayer right now, all this kind of stuff. And I said, fine, I'm going to carry on with the liturgy. But I thought about it. I thought about it when I thought, well, maybe, they're right in one way. It's the garment. It's got to be filled with the living word. But this woman was still healed by touching. And I began to think that all that lovely liturgy is trying to make the hem of Christ's garment as beautiful as possible. And my job as chaplain was to notice. People often came to chaplain and said, don't try and convert me, chaplain. I'm not here for the religion. I'm here for the music. Fine. But why are you here for the music? What is happening? What transaction is it? And the poor disciple that was sent to find this woman and help her have the confidence to come and stand in front of you, probably had about 3 minutes to do it. And my view was that I had about 3 years to notice when something beautiful had happened and to sort of help someone think maybe I could go from touch. Maybe not now. Maybe I could go from touching the hem to a face-to-face encounter. And that was what chaplain. I think maybe that's what Lewis House is about as well in its own way. So yeah, I'm quite anxious not to rush to judgment, not to say, oh, but this is inadequate, because in a sense everything is inadequate. Nothing is adequate to the glory of God, and every one of us, including me, is on a pilgrimage, is on a journey, is not there, is still waiting for that fullness, that pleroma of God's presence, of which we've had hints. So there's a sense in which you don't cease to be a seeker. In fact, when I did come to faith in the second year, end of the second year, one of the things I feared most about Christianity, and which I found repellent in some of the people who claimed to be Christian, was stasis. Like, that's it. I found it. I have this formula. I know what it is. I need never think about any of these things again because I'm in. Job done. And I thought, where's the development? Where's the growth? Where's the exploration? Where's the journey? Where's the pilgrimage? It didn't seem to be there. But when I went back to the great Christian poets, it was there all the time. Anyway, so a rather long answer to a short question. I don't know if they're still moving the microphone around. There's a guy down here as well. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for all that you've said. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned this divorce that we've all grown up as the children of, the divorce of imagination and reason. And as someone who is very close to the season of life where I hope to be raising children, I wondered if you had any words for how we can try to bring the reality of the true marriage of imagination and reason under Christ to our children in a world where we're dealing with all of these consequences.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant question. Well, the first thing I want to say is thank God, God has sent us the children to bring the imagination to us. That's the first way around, is that when you're reading a book with a kid, even if they haven't got words yet, a picture kid, you learn from them what delight and awe and wonder is. And it's not for nothing that Jesus took the child in the midst and says, to these belong the kingdom of heaven. Certainly that was my kids gave me an excuse to get back into all the fairy tales that I should have had the humility to go back and read even as a single adult. But reading with children is such a joy. So I think there's that. And I think to co-imagine with them is really good. But yes, I do understand they're going to go out into a world where that split is still there. And particularly the idea that objective truth is only what can be weighed and measured and is dry fact. And if that's the only true thing, then the world is without value or meaning. It is a certain quantity, but it means nothing. And if you say meaning is only subjective, then you're saying it's less than truly real. Of course, the subject-object split is absurd, because one of the first things we can say about being at all, is I am, right? I have unmediated knowledge of my I amness. Everything else is mediated through my senses, which might be deceived. But when I say I am, I subject, am verb, but what am I? Where's the object? Well, the object, it turns out, is me. I am me. There we are, a little grammar lesson. So at that moment, I am completely subject and completely object simultaneously. And yet I've grown up in a world that says object good, subject bad, object true, subject subjectivity, we don't want it. Do you see? So it was always a false premise, and our kids will grow up in that split world. So we have to model, if first of all they restore to us our imagination, then we model or try to model for them a way of saying that imagination is not childish, and it's not silly, and it's not irrelevant. It might be a way of imagining something that we need to know. It might be a picture that tells us the truth. It might be a bodying forth of something that we would otherwise not know at all. And so we have to honor, we have to learn from our children and then honor their imagination and defend it when it's attacked. I think there's a guy there.
Right, I think we have time for one more question. It's going to be right up here in the front.
There's a persistent hand up there.
So of all the poems you've written, what is your personal favorite heaven to earth poem? And what is your personal favorite earth to heaven poem?
Oh, wow, of the ones I've written.
Yes.
There we are. Okay. I suppose a heaven to earth poem would be my poem O Sapientia, O Wisdom, because it's a reference to the Advent antiphon, which begins, O wisdom that proceedeth from the mouth of the Most High, rightly and sweetly ordering all things. I mean, I could come and recite it by heart, but it's the one that begins, I cannot think unless I have been thought, nor can I speak unless I have been spoken. I cannot teach except as I am taught, or break the bread except as I am broken. O mind behind the mind through which I seek, O light within the light by which I see, O word beneath the words with which I speak, O founding unfound wisdom, finding meaning. So that, in a sense, starts there. And it only finishes it with images, at the very end. In terms of the other way around, I've written a certain amount of poetry about food and drink, I confess. I've got a poem called Pour Out the Wine. I've got a poem about cheese, because Chesterton said that the poets had been mysteriously silent about cheese. So I have the whole cheese metaphor. So that one begins, the poets have been silent about cheese because while every subject is their message, cheese is the very medium of their work. We all drink in language with our mother's milk, but poets curdle words until they bite with substance and a flavor of their own. And then I go on to compare a whole series of different poets to different kinds of cheese. So that's, I also have a pub poem with the repeated line, I'll have another pint of porter, please. And I was once reciting this poem with some friends in a pub, and because it's a repeated line, they were all going. And this was in a pub in England, you've got to go to the bar, but in a pub in America, they come to you. So they were more and more voices, about 10 of us at this table. And we finally got to the third time the line came up, and they all went, I'll have another pint of porter, please. And the waitress was standing right beside them, and she disappeared, and she came back with these 10 pints of porter. And apparently the round was on me because I'd written the poem. Yeah. Okay, I think we're probably drawing to the end of our time, but
All right, let's
so
give
good of you.
Malcolm another round of applause. Thank you for that. And thank you again to the Jiracs and the Sloans for sponsoring this month's lecture. We still have some of Malcolm's books out back if you want to mad rush out there to get those. And we will see you all next month, Wednesday the 4th, for Molly Worthen. Thank you for coming.